Thank you so very much for coming. This is our Career Pathways, Fields and Industries of International Law panel. We have with us today four professionals in various fields of public and private international law. We have joining us on Zoom, Andrea Cayley, who is the Executive Director of the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law's Washington, D.C. programs. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Columbia University, a JD from Temple University, and a PhD from Leiden University. Ms. Cayley worked for 2 decades as a lawyer with the United Nations. She began her career as a UN liaison officer to the US Congress, then spent 15 years in The Hague working in the office of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and 4 years in Cambodia, working on prosecutions of the Khmer Rouge. Ms. Cayley is one of the founders and experts of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, the official US, UK, EU response effort to war crimes in Ukraine. We also have with us Rachel López. Rachel López is the James E. Beasley Professor of Law here at Temple, where she writes and teaches in the areas of criminal law, public international law, international human rights law, and transitional justice. Professor López holds a Bachelor of Arts from Northwestern University and a JD from the University of Texas School of Law. She also received an LLM in French and European law from Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. Professor López previously worked at the Open Society Justice Initiative, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the Center for Constitutional Rights. She's a recognized expert and publicist in international criminal law. Eugene Hsue is an IOS alumnus who joins us from the Penn Center for Innovation. He's a graduate of Cornell University and holds a JD from Temple Law and a master's from the University of Pittsburgh. Mr. Hsue drafts and negotiates collaborative research agreements, material transfer agreements, and confidential disclosure agreements with the Penn Center. He served as Temple Law's foreign, comparative, and international law librarian, and then the head of research at the Second Circuit. He also worked at the City of Philadelphia Law Department's Intellectual Property Division, where he negotiated software and hardware contracts. Professor Heath is our resident expert in international trade, investment law, dispute resolution, and the national security dimensions of trade and investment. He holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Texas at Austin and a JD as well as LLM from the New York University School of Law. Professor Heath previously practiced international law and arbitration at the U.S. State Department and at Curtis, Mallet Prevost, Colt, and Moyle. He has represented governments and state-owned enterprises before the International Court of Justice, the Iran-United States Claims Tribunal, and the federal courts. We welcome our panelists. Let's jump right into it. We'd like to ask you about your law school experience first and foremost. What did you do in law school to prepare you for your particular field and career paths? Feel free.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, I think the answer is at the outset pretty obvious. I mean, I came in with international law, but I had no idea what it really was. So if that's sort of where you are, that's normal. I took classes that sort of reflected that interest, especially as I selected international law as a one elective. It was available. I hear it sometimes is, sometimes not. I did upper level courses that also reflected that interest, probably too many. Actually, I sort of regret that I didn't take things like antitrust, formal classes. But I focused a lot on that, and I directed my summer internship searches in that direction. I looked at NGOs and UN opportunities and other things like that. And so I think that's a good way to get the ball rolling for the meat and potatoes of it.
I think I'll echo my colleagues here that it's, of course, critically important to take courses in the area of public international law and international human rights law. One of my regrets is also not taking as many private international law courses and even corporations as it relates to various litigation I've been involved with over the years. But I will underscore that for me, the most important thing I did in law school was get my foot in the door at various organizations and as much as possible get practical experience in international law. For me, that meant being involved in a number of legal clinics, which luckily here at Temple we have an incredible, robust array of clinics. Through that, I was able to represent people held in Guantanamo Bay, even was able to go with my professors to the US Supreme Court for a case that we worked on that was pending there. And for me, that's been sort of transformative in shaping my direction. And then internships. I'm hoping we can talk a little bit more about strategies around internships. I wanted to get sort of like high level experience, and so interned at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, human rights. To some extent, that was incredible because I got to see high level exposure to how public international law operates. The challenge with that is that those organizations don't often hire people from the United States, and so it provided very limited paths for having a career. So I think there's some strategy that goes involved in choosing your internships with international law.
So for myself, I would say I will echo all those things in terms of that's also what I did. I took a lot of international law classes, international commercial transactions were done off, international law colloquium. There was international transactions that had a negotiating aspect that two partners actually at Training Words, I think it has a new name now, but Pepper Hamilton actually. Pepper Hamilton, now it's called Trout and Pepper, they taught it. However, I'll probably say in terms of practically finding a job, I became very close with a lot of the foreign LM students, as well as the LM Center that welcomed the LM students. And I had opportunities to do an internship in Italy or in China. Ultimately, I did not take opportunities up because at that time I was in a very close relationship with a woman who's now my wife. But if you're willing to travel, having authentic relationships with people from other countries or becoming very friendly with the LLM Center, that can be very beneficial because you can hear about the posting even before it happens. You can, oh, there's this opportunity, but would you be interested? And that's even before it's publicly available. So for one, that's what happened to me as a student.
Ms. Cayley?
Hi, thank you, Miran. Originally I came to law school specifically for international law. Prior to coming to Temple, I spent 2 years, this was in the late 80s, getting a master's degree in Yugoslav studies in the former Yugoslavia. That my family background is from that region. So when I lived there, the war started the second year that I was living there. So I was very committed to finding a way that I could support and get accountability for the crimes that were happening there. And this is way before any of the courts had been established. I had started Columbia School of Journalism and then made the decision to go to law school and came to Temple, which is my local law school. I lived in Philadelphia. I'm from Philadelphia. While in law school, my first year, I was able, through just networking, going to different events concerning the former Yugoslavia, get a full-time while in law school job researching and reviewing war crimes cases that Human Rights Watch was monitoring. So I would have, this is before computers had email, I would have boxes sent from New York that had full case files from the former Yugoslavia. And I would review those cases and what different people in different regions, different ethnic groups were saying was happening because I could read the language. While I was in law school, I was the co-president of ILS. I joined I think it was only the second year that there was an international law journal. I joined the International Law Journal. I received a SPIN scholarship, a student public interest scholarship, to spend my 2L summer in Washington, D.C., working for the United Nations. I was intern in an office they had here that liaises with Congress. That turned into a job after my 3L year, and shortly, I started in the fall of 94. And at that point, we got word in the UN that the ICTY was established, the Yugoslav Tribunal was established, and they were hiring UN staff. So I immediately ran into my boss's office and said, please put my name forward. And I was the first batch of UN hires to the ICTY. And then I just stayed in that for 20 plus years before turning to academia.
Oh, thank you so much for such diverse experiences in your law school and your careers. You mentioned the Human Rights Watch and various cross-border organizations. What are some of the most valuable legal networks, associations, groups, collaborative networks that have really helped you establish yourself in your field of international law?
Yeah, I know, so now as a professional, I think ASIL, American Society of International Law, we're very active in that. We have, our university here has a full membership for students. So I fly out my international law students to DC to attend that. It's a great way to network. In my day, and I think this also applies to you, I'd also go to a lot of, conferences, meetings. If there was a speaker at Penn, if there was a speaker in New York at NYU, I would just get on the train and go. And in fact, that is how I met the person who ended up hiring me to come to DC for that internship. So I really am a big believer in networking, but I think I definitely go beyond those organizations. There's Perry World House at Penn that has tons of things. FPRI is very happy to have young people come, and also, just getting on the train and going to New York or DC really broadens your experiences. I think keeping an eye on what conferences are going on, what sort of meetings, speakers are happening all over the East Coast is a great way, beyond just the ABILA, the American, the ASIL, or the the American branch of the International Law Society.
I guess what I would encourage you to do, in addition to networking in ASIL or the ABA section of international law, those organizations have trade publications. They might not be a scholarly peer-reviewed journal. Actually, I think ASIL is considered at that level, but they are always hungry for content. If you can publish a paper or be invited to speak on a panel, okay, to get your name out there, that will really drive the networking. I didn't do this until after my law school career, so if you can have a one-up on me, that'd be great for you. But for example, later when I was more established in my career, I was getting invited to talk about how you research for part of bar, how you research Chinese law, that depend on that, and I was able to get published in some of those areas. I think getting published or getting your name out there to be recognized for something that you love professionally, that will only help your networking.
So I want to sort of talk a little bit about maybe picking up on this point of networking and talking a little bit about what I call more sort of service level networking and the difference between that and niche networking. Because I think that there's a difference, and not everybody is good at all things. And so I feel like I've never been really good at like going to an event and meeting someone and having that turn into something. My success has more been in what I call deep networking, which is making the most out of being, say, an intern somewhere, basically, in some context, like really treating it as if it were, my full-time job, and really showing them how committed I was. And those experiences, for example, I was in Society Institute at the ICTR, and Inter-American Commission are really what built my career, because I showed them how committed I was, and they continue to this day to be sources of support. The people I met there continued to sort of make sure that I was included in various things that were happening. The other thing I want to mention in terms of networking and sort of organizations that are helpful is that much like Andrea pointed out in terms of ASOL, we also at Temple are members of ASOL. So you have access to going to the conferences at a reduced rate, maybe even for free. And so that's something to really take advantage of. Early on, it's very hard, as we'll talk about, to launch a career at the entry level in international human rights. One way I was able to do that was by getting what's called the Helton Fellowship from ASOL, the International Society of International Law. And that's sort of what launched me and helped me to do field work in Cameroon, which then sort of gave me a baseline to build from, which is, I think, critical, particularly in international human rights. So I was actually really good.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo a lot of what's been said, and I think one theme that sort of comes through is being a bit of a self-starter. Sometimes when I talk to students at Temple, I hear that they're interested in international law careers, and here I'm just reporting what I hear. I'm not sort of imprinting it with my own judgment. But what I hear is, I'm interested in international law careers, but career services doesn't know anything about what international law careers are, and so I don't know who to call, and there aren't that many opportunities. So I've applied to what's on the message board or the platform or whatever it is you guys have now, but I don't know what else to do. And it's like, well, have you looked up who the top international law firms are in the area? Have you sent emails to people in practice areas that I don't know if career services encourages you to do that or not. I encourage you to do it. Similarly, folks have talked a lot about different ways to put yourself out there, going to conferences, right? Has anybody been to the American Society of International Law's annual meeting? I know some people have. It's alienating at first, right? Like, it's a big meeting in a hotel in DC. Everybody's in suits. Yeah, I don't know about you, but whenever I'm in a suit, I'm itchy, I'm uncomfortable. I feel like a 7-year-old in church, and I don't want to be there. I want to be at home in my pajamas, listening to Casey Kasem's Top 40 Countdown, and so I don't know what to do. But I still went, and I was seen. I didn't make any deep connections there. But later, when people started seeing me turn up elsewhere, because I responded to a call for papers that I saw online. Or I did, they're like, oh, didn't I see you from this other place? And they start putting me together, and I said, you're around, you're a presence, you're someone who is here, right? And then that means that, I'm someone who has a demonstrated interest in this. And then when they see I'm actually good at something that I did, then they might think about hiring me. And so finding different ways to put yourself out there, I think, is really important. I think people have this idea that law school is this sort of conveyor belt to a practice that doesn't require a lot of self-starting effort on your part sometimes. And I wish it were true, but it's not true. And also some people have this idea that they're not gonna put themselves out there until they're fully ready. That they're not gonna go out there until they have a coming out party. And I think you can't do that. You have to put yourself out there when you're kind of ready, when you're a little bit rough around the edges, but people can see that you put some effort into whatever you did, right? And so I think that sort of ties up a lot of the themes that we've heard.
Yeah, I want to pounce on that point and reinforce it. People are not necessarily, unless it's like an award, a call for papers to which there's attached a certain award. That there's like a competition and there's real money involved. And ASIL or ABA Section of International, they have that for students, and you can shoot that, you can go for that, definitely be recognized. But many times people are not looking for perfection, they're looking for something with good faith that you've done your best shot at. And if that turns up in a trade publication, that is really an open door. That's a really open door for you to go and speak and make real connections with others who are involved in that same discrete field of international private.
And thank you for the point of being a self-starter. In that respect, as we're considering employment requirements and certain legal necessities, maybe even immigration records, what are some of the credentials that really make an advocate or a student of international law stand out? help them move along in a career? Publications, specific mentorships, what do you recommend? Fellowships, etc.
So yeah, I think that's a really good question. There's a lot of different ways you can take it. I mean, immigration status is a big deal. For example, if you want to work in the federal government, like I did, that's or the federal courts. But the thread I'll pick up on is publications, because people think that, like, why would I publish something? I'm not trying to be an academic, and I don't really know how to answer that in the abstract. But what I can tell you concretely is that when I was in law school, I thought my dream job was to work at Human Rights Watch, which is not an academic organization. And I met with someone from Human Rights Watch who looked at my resume and they said, "Have you published it?" And I said, "Well, I did work on this. I'm not the named author, but I did work on this report that was, a UN report." And they're like, "Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to make a little space in your resume, like in between experience and additional information, and you're going to drop publications, and you're going to put that right there, and that's going to help your resume stand out." I don't know why it works, right? But it does. If I'm going to speculate, I think it shows some initiative. It shows some deep experience, right? And it shows some demonstrated interest in the area. And again, like publishing a note or a comment with the journal is one way to do it. It's not the only way. Publishing a report, right, or being a co-author on some kind of like white paper or report is another way to do it that is equally valuable in a lot of these spaces, especially the non-academic.
So I want to highlight a couple of different skills. A lot of the skills that I think are underemphasized in law school that I think have been critical for me in particular. One of those is language skills. And so I know for a fact that I applied for, one of my first human rights jobs out of law school that had 300 applications. And the only reason I really got out of that pile of 300 is because I spoke English, Spanish, and French. And they needed someone that could speak all those languages to do the job. And so that was, for me, transformative, because I don't know if I would have stood out but for that, those language skills. The other part that I think is so interesting, particularly as it relates to international human rights law, is that practice doesn't look the way that we're trained in law school to perform, right? So we think of, my students are here will attest to this, right? That my class is a little bit different because I focus on teaching different types of skills. Oftentimes we think of law school as a training ground for court. Very few human rights lawyers go to court in that way. Many of them, for example, are Human Rights Watch, writing reports, conducting interviews. And so a lot of non-traditional skills are really important in that field. For example, I applied for a position at Human Rights Watch and was required as part of the test you had to take in order to get this job. And one of the things that you were required to do was to write a press release. I had never been taught to write a press release and felt completely at sea. And so some of these skills, it's very interesting what you, and so another one, for example, is the ability, particularly in human rights context, to interview people and to engage in really deep listening. And that's something that, I really felt was an underdeveloped skill that I had to sort of cultivate afterwards.
So I'd say two things in terms of public international law. That's probably the most experience I have. Two things would be language skills. And the second thing, foundation in public international law. In 2014, I interviewed for the position for the director of the library at the International Court of Justice. So the UN flew me out to The Hague to interview long to go for it. And I was actually the only American. And so two things happened that brought these 2 points I've just shared with you really home to me in terms of the nitty-gritty. The first thing was that after they gave us a nice afternoon tour, the second day, so there were 2 days of interviews. The first day, unbeknownst to all the candidates, and without any notice, they led us into a room and they had us take an international law exam for I think it was about 5 or 6 hours nonstop, with only 30 minutes for lunch, with no notice at all. So basically, it was like a law school exam. And you could go on the internet, and I could see a lot of people freaking out a little bit. But because I had roots in how to research international law in terms of the Hague Cabinet Collective Course, or the Mexican Encyclopedia, I could talk about the question was the law of the sea. I had the methodology to go about answering the question in an intelligent way. It was very hard, but I would say having a context for what you want to do in terms of taking courses or knowing what the primary sources are, what the authoritative secondary sources are, that's really important. And that's one thing that law school did give me. The second thing I will say is my interviews, so that was the first day, all exams. Second day, all my interviews were in French. Okay, and my interviews with the top guy were in French. And I am fluent in French. I studied in France for a semester, and I was in a dorm that spoke only French in undergrad. So the guy basically said to me, you know, your French is great, we would love you, except, you know, you don't have experience managing a large library budget. And he said some things that made me feel, you know, 10 years ago, I was only in my mid-30s. I felt like I was a token American. You know, they needed an American to be there. But basically, I knew I definitely was going to get it. But he said, but basically, I could see the guy from Vienna, guy from Austria come out, and actually some Europeans whose French skills were not that great, they would come down with a critical face and they would just be like, you know, just to not go well because I wasn't able to speak to him. So if you want to get into public international law, probably the major languages of the UN, whether it be Mandarin Chinese, French, Spanish, they're the major languages you should definitely think about.
Ms. Cayley?
Yeah, so I completely agree with my panelists. I do know also that at some of the most senior positions in the UN, especially at the ICC and ICJ, you do have a lot of just English speakers, old white men. So there is that structure out there. It's great to have the language skills, but there's also a sort of a double edge with that. If you come in as a native Ukrainian speaker, for example, and you're working with our group, there's almost always, I don't even want to say, you're almost put on the level of also being a translator. So it's making yourself clear from the start that you're a lawyer there who speaks the second language, who speaks Arabic or Ukrainian or whatever language that is needed at any of the international courts, but making it clear that you're there as a lawyer and not as an interpreter, because it can become almost a negative in that context. I think networking as well as what internships you have during the year. So I'm lucky that our university has a campus here in DC, but we're putting students in internships during the year. So we have some at the Clooney Foundation, Amnesty. They're able to both build their kind of resume, their work experience, as well as get those experiences that can take them to the next level. So if they're graduating now, they can try to apply for honors in DOJ, maybe work at Human Rights Special Prosecution Office. We have a number who are trying to get into the State Department. So I think looking in Philadelphia, there's not as much international, but you can do a lot virtually. We have students in Arizona who are working virtually for Clooney and doing research for them, or who are working virtually with the State Department and helping on the establishment of a new hybrid court for Liberia, doing the background research into that. So I think you shouldn't be limited now in the world of, like, as I'm appearing on Zoom, of virtual. I think broadening that experience during the school year can be really important, not just waiting until your summer internships can help.
We wanted to ask a substantive question to do with your particular industries and fields. The understanding is that there are commercial areas of international law and public international law. In your experience, how does experience in one potentially translate into credentials and authority in the other, or would you say these are separate tracks to the notion of many opportunities and really trying to make sure that, say, you have citizenship restraints, immigration restraints, if you have the interest, the passion to contribute to international law, how do you navigate these private versus public tracks in your experience?
So I think there are a number of, not many areas, but there are a number that they do overlap. For example, international arbitration. One of the amazing student fellows we had here who graduated from Georgetown Law School, went on to work as an international arbitration lawyer in New York for a firm. And I think a lot of the skills he developed dealing with different legal systems, different backgrounds, all of that is assisting him. There are very few firms that have these they're private firms that do sort of represent countries. For example, Arnold and Porter, they have a group there headed by John Bellinger that is very focused on representing countries. So in terms of disputes, there's also Covington here that's representing Ukraine at the ICJ. I think there's a lot of ways if you're interested. My work has never really touched sort of private commercial law. The only areas that it's gone into that is perhaps in some of the regulations, violations of sanctions that we're seeing with Russia. But yeah, I'm not the best person to talk about the real crossover into private international law.
Mr. Hsue?
So I'm a transactional attorney. So I negotiate research agreements with the University of Pennsylvania. I think so what I do now is not public international law, it's not even private international law, it's contracts. But I do deal a lot with GDPR. So I am dealing with foreign law and choice of law clauses, choice of venue, foreign choice. Those are negotiated because what I do is deal with data. A lot of research agreements and what is generated out of university or inventions that has to do a lot with data. So what I do, I would say that I appeared into that group before. I do have friends who have made that career choice, who are legal officers at the UN. It seems to me it's very different. It's a very different life. That they're definitely, they're more policy wonks. They're very sharp in what they do. And I was on the cusp of that. I've been at the corporates before, but what I do now, I do need to have a foundation and being familiar with concepts from the GDPR. So that's what we do.
I can think of a number of ways in which my career in international human rights was dovetailed with both sort of like corporate law, conventional corporate law, and private international law. One of which is that my first job out of law school really focused on anti-corruption. And in fact, a lot of the work that I did came out of litigation, which I was not a part of, but revealed litigation against First Bank, which revealed sort of like the pathways of corruption, how they existed. And so a lot of my work initially was sort of digging deep in a lot of these documents that I didn't really understand at the time, but was able to sort of get my bearings. And I think I would have done better if I had, taken some more private international law courses. The other part is a lot of my work really at my mid-career was involving suing transnational corporations for human rights violations. And part of that involved really understanding the corporate structure of those organizations, sort of like what would, sort of like where were they headquartered, what were their relations to their subsidiaries. And that too, really I think is where sort of like there are these areas in international human rights law where it kind of merges with private international.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different ways to take this question too, right? Like you could talk about the practice opportunities, right? So as was already mentioned, right, some law firms that mainly do international commercial work also take on clients that have them end up doing other things in public international law that can be interesting, right? Anything from doing to like international criminal stuff, like human rights, to law of war and cyber war and all sorts of cool stuff. And so like the boundaries between these fields aren't rigid, and you aren't stuck. by what you initially chose. I mean, you can also take this question conceptually and sort of how are these things related, right? My experience, I'm sometimes referred to as a trade lawyer. I'm not sure I am. I'm sometimes referred to as an investment lawyer, which I regrettably have been. But at least if you're my student, I think this. I'm not a vulgar Marxist, but sometimes I sound like one, and I think that everything is economic, right? Everything at bottom is like, why are people being killed in X part of the world? There's an economic explanation for why. And so I think that exposing yourself to that side of things and thinking about how the international economy works and who it works for and why is actually an extraordinarily important part of going to do whatever it is you're going to do. So yeah.
Thank you for such a frank and proper reflection on some of the substantive aspects of your careers.
I want to be sure to mention something because as part of this, we were asked to sort of think of organizations in our field that students might look for jobs. And so I happily had a student update this. I have some copies up here, basically the list of all the most prominent human rights organizations and also job search engines. So I have a few copies here. I'm going to also send it to you to distribute because there's links that of course won't work in the hard copy. But just so you all are aware, right there on the front table. And
we'd like to open it up at this time to any student questions, anything that might have popped up. If anyone would like to ask our panelists anything goes. Oh, please go ahead, sir.
I can ask a question. About language competency specifically. What is the standard measure for fluency for the purposes of doing legal work? And additionally, do you guys have any recommendations on balancing law school with additional language training?
Well, I'm monolingual. I came into law school monolingual, and I made a decision early on that I could not do both law school and monolingual. And so, to the extent that that's the decision that you're facing, at least I made it through.
I was able to sort of had a loophole in my university. So at University of Texas, I was able to get an LLM and the credits counted towards my JD. And I was able to pay French tuition, which was huge because it was basically a quarter of the price of US tuition. And so, and my program was in French. And so my French was, to be honest, very shoddy when I started that. And it was basically a crash course because much like you, everyone that I was sort of a year-long program, everyone I encountered spoke French, and that's how I was able to develop it. And it's interesting, I was reflecting, like, my language skills have really diminished, but they were very fundamental in those first jobs. And so I think much like Andrea Cayley had suggested, like, as you get further up in your career, English is the dominant language, but it's interesting that in those first years, it was critical that I had a broader, language. The other thing I think is that, I feel like my language skills never came from classes. It was always from being immersed. And there's lots of tremendous opportunities for that. So for example, in Guatemala, there are amazing Spanish language schools that don't charge that much. And so it's very easy to go down and be immersed for, anything from a few weeks to a couple months.
I would say if you're very serious about getting a job that job itself requires fluency in one of the UN official languages, considering studying in that country may be essential. That's really how my French got so good, was because I had spent a year abroad, a semester abroad in France during my undergrad years. So that's really how I had gotten so good from having studied it from 6th grade. Really, that's when it all congealed. I think, but to that point, there are opportunities that don't require those. If you're gunning for that, every country, the Ministry of Education in France, the Ministry of Education in the People's Republic of China, they have the equivalent of the TOEFL. Like, for France, it's like the Delta, or for China, it's like a higher speed also. It's like the HSK. So you take that test and you can say on your resume, like, no, it's not just like I'm doing it. It's like, no, I passed this certain level. So there are objective indicators.
And Ms. Cayley, to the question of language proficiency and its metrics.
So at the UN, if you want to be classified as fluent in a specific language, they do have an exam and a verbal examination as well, and it does increase your salary. So if you can say that you're fluent in 3 or 4 different languages and have passed that proficiency, you will be on a higher level within the United Nations salary scheme. State Department as well. For me, I grew up fluent in something that was at one point one language, Serbo-Croatian, but then split into, so now I'm fluent in like 10 languages, but split into each ethnic group calling it their own language. And then studied abroad during my undergrad degree. For me, it was absolutely essential to my work. One of the areas that I worked on was establishing the de jure responsibility of military and political leaders. I was able to review all of the laws of the former Yugoslavia that showed, for example, where Milosevic fell, what were his powers under the Yugoslav law. I also was able to build much closer relationships with witnesses than people who didn't speak the language. And I was also very aware when there was something that perhaps a witness or an expert was disgruntled about, that they wouldn't tell an Australian investigator or British lawyer. I was usually the first one who picked up on all of that. So I think it does give you a major advantage in this area of law.
Thank you, Ms. Cayley. Thank you to all of our panelists for the privilege of your perspectives. Let's give them a round of applause.
Miran, if anybody, I'm very loyal, even though I'm working at a different law school, very loyal and connected to Temple. And it's so great to see all of you. And I know Professor López, so I'm so glad I did not have all of these international law professors when I was at Temple, but please feel free, Miran, to share my email with all of the ILS students. I'd love to talk or help out in any way.
Absolutely. We'll be sharing each panelist's emails, contact information, and the list of organizations, as well as the recording of this panel.
I would like to just give a very short but sincere word of encouragement. I've literally been where you are before, literally in this finance, in this hall and ILS alum. Law school is hard. If you can carve out the time to get recognized professionally for something that you love while you are at law school, whether that's contributing to a paper, being invited to speak at something, to go for that, do that. It's going to require an enormous amount of time. If you can do that for something that you love, be recognized for it professionally, that's probably, that's my takeaway from this, and just to encourage you.
We'll build a strong network and a connected community. Thank you, everyone.